In April of 1841, Silas Rutled announced something that made even the most ruthless men of Colleton County blanch. He declared that his daughter, Catherine, 28 years old, weighing well over 260 pounds, would be put entirely under the authority of an enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross, not as a mere nurse, not as an attendant. In every way that mattered, except on paper, Ezekiel would be her keeper. The county's white society hissed scandal and speculation, but none of them understood the bargain Silas had struck, or the patient, terrible work Ezekiel had already begun. By November, Catherine's body and mind had shifted into shapes no one could explain. 13 men were dead. Cypress Grove lay in ruin, a blackened skeleton. What happened between an enslaved man and a plantation owner's daughter would become a story people whispered around fires for generations. Half terror, half awe. But first, we go back to the beginning. Spring in Colleton County arrived like a weight. The heat and humidity pressed down until the air had the thickness of wet cloth. The Combe River moved slow and dark, carrying reflections of live oaks draped in Spanish moss that hung like funeral veils. Rice paddies spread across the lowlands, flat, reflective surfaces worked by hands that never rested, bodies wading in water from dawn until the first stars. Wealth here was a product of suffering, prosperity extracted by calculation and force. Men called it order. It was, in truth, organized cruelty. Cypress Grove occupied 800 acres of middling ground, productive, respectable enough to turn a profit, not rich enough to sit among the county's most powerful families. Silas Rutled wanted that acceptance with a hunger that had hollowed him. He owned 58 enslaved people, a number that made him comfortable in most men's eyes, but barely a footnote among the true elite. Those families summered in Charleston, sent sons away to northern universities, and carried names that opened doors and broke reputations. With a single whisper, Silas had married Elizabeth Yancey in 1812. The marriage brought land, a tidy name, and, when Elizabeth died in childbirth in 1813, a daughter the couple named Catherine Elizabeth had been practical, methodical. She kept ledgers and manners with equal precision. Silas, left a widower, raised his child while pouring himself into the pursuit of influence. He grew tall and thin in the way obsession thins a man, hair whitening early, face taking on the severity of someone who believed mercy a mistake. In business, he was cutting but not dishonorable. Again and again he would drive hard bargains, and then, to the astonishment of rivals, keep the word he had given. Catherine grew up apart. Tutors taught her at home. She did not fit in polite parlors or the rough company of the fields. By 1841, she was 28, corpulent in a way doctors called pathological, purchased diagnoses, hysteria, and female nervous disorders, followed by a steady diet of medicines that dulled and swelled her. She had violent fits, screaming, flinging objects, once attacking her father with a letter opener and leaving a scar across his left hand. The county spoke of her with a kind of performative pity. Poor Silas, burdened with a mad daughter, never imagining the truth that waited behind her eyes. No one knew what Catherine had seen at 12. No one knew that what they called madness was, in some ways, the only sane response to living inside monsters. On April 7th, a letter came by private courier. Silas, expecting routine business, opened 3 pages of heavy paper sealed with red wax. The emblem impressed into the seal, an odd, unmistakable glyph, a scythe crossed with wheat stalks, the mark of the Brethren of the Harvest. The Brethren were 13 men who met in darkness to perform rituals they believed nourished the land through blood. They stitched together twisted European mystery practices and knowledge taken from enslaved spiritual traditions, bending both into a theology of dominion. The strong consume the weak. Sometimes, quite literally, Silas had been a member since 1822, present at perhaps 40 gatherings where the rites moved from disturbing into monstrous. The letter said Silas was in debt, $12,000, a ruinous sum built from bad wagers and failed ventures. The normal remedy would be bankruptcy, selling land, dispersing enslaved people, losing the world he had built, but the brethren offered another way. Public humiliation instead of ruin. Silas must publicly place his daughter under the absolute authority of one enslaved man for a year, declare it a medical necessity. In a society that prided itself on protecting white women, he would effectively say his daughter was worth less than a single piece of property. In return, the brethren would wipe his debts clean and shepherd his restoration into polite company. Silas sat with the candle for hours. He weighed ruin against humiliation and chose the latter, the choice his world taught him to make every time. Preserve status, sacrifice flesh. 3 days later, another letter named the man to serve as Catherine's keeper. Ezekiel Cross, 33, a recent purchase from Virginia. Supposedly a carpenter and an herbalist, quiet and obedient. What the papers did not say was deliberate. Ezekiel had been chosen for purpose. He had not arrived by chance. He carried a different fire, an old, burning hunger for a kind of justice that the law could not deliver. Ezekiel came to Cypress Grove on April 13th, sun harsh and flat over the drive. He sat in the wagon bed as Silas stepped onto the porch. Where many enslaved people lowered their eyes, Ezekiel looked directly at Silas, steady, measuring he was tall, broad-shouldered, unmarked by the whipping scars that would have been assumed proof of suffering. His hands were the hands of a craftsman, calloused, precise. The trader Henderson handed paperwork to Silas, and as if rehearsed, said, "Ezekiel Cross, as requested, quiet, capable, carefully selected." Silas barely glanced at the pages. "You understand why you are here?" Silas asked. "Yes, sir," Ezekiel replied. His voice was calm, the accent of Virginia softening the words. "Your duties will begin tomorrow," Silas said. Ezekiel was shown to a small cabin near the house, apart from the common slave quarters. Basic supplies, explicit orders, Catherine's care, complete responsibility, failure punished. Ezekiel answered all demands with the same quiet obedience. "Yes, sir." And when night finally closed, when the house settled into the hush that follows day, he sat on his thin bed and unwrapped a small cloth bundle. Folded inside was a piece of worn paper, 3 names in a child's unsteady hand: Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. His wife and children, sold away 3 years before to a plantation in Alabama designed to work humans until they broke. Ezekiel had followed the trail south for 2 years, moving deliberately from place to place to learn what men like Silas kept hidden. He had discovered whispers of the brethren, their rights, their immunity. When he learned his new master would be Silas Rutled, he understood what chance had given him: access to the house, to the cellar, to the ledger. April 14th was his first official day. Judith, an older house slave with hair threaded gray, tapped at Catherine's door and led Ezekiel up. The room was dim and thick with the sweet rot of mercury. Books lay scattered. A picture lay shattered against the wall. Catherine sat wrapped in a stained dressing gown, cheeks puffy, hands trembling on the arms of her chair. She met Ezekiel with a look that passed from confusion to distrust to fury. "I do not want more treatments," she spat. "Send him away." Ezekiel closed the door, Letting the house settle beyond the panels, he moved quietly, making himself unthreatening, and asked one steady, dangerous question. "What are you supposed to forget?" For a moment, the angry mask fell. Something raw and vulnerable surfaced. Catherine's voice shifted. When he spoke of mercury, of drug dependence, of symptoms that matched long-term poisoning, the pieces began to line up in her mind like the teeth of a trap. He did not know the cellar then, or the brethren's ledger, but he knew enough to offer her a different danger. The truth. He offered her the unthinkable possibility that her treatments were a means of control, that her father's hands had been busy for years, turning her into a silenced thing. Catherine listened. Rage settled into purpose. She had been dismissed for years as fragile and foolish. Now someone offered strategy. She told him, in fragments and coded confessions, that she had watched things at 12 that no child should see. Ezekiel unfolded his story in return: the sale of his family, the way Silas had smiled while splitting them apart. Where one had grief, the other had a patient, accumulated fury. They formed an agreement in that dim room, not spoken in legal words, but in a handshake of intent. Ezekiel would stop the medicines, wean her slowly, build her strength. She would translate the fragments of memory into evidence. When Silas planned his public announcement 2 weeks later, they would be ready to begin. Silas's announcement unfolded in the Cypress Grove dining room on April 29th. A gathering of 40, an elaborate supper, a carefully staged humiliation presented as medicine and salvation. Silas spoke of doctors from Charleston and Philadelphia, then presented Ezekiel as a healer. "Ezekiel will assume full responsibility for my daughter's welfare," Silas said, and the room shifted. Pity, confusion, a thin, angry disbelief. Catherine sat at his right hand and played the obedient daughter, all while gripping the napkin until her knuckles went white. Ezekiel moved among the guests like a shadow, hearing names, watching gestures, cataloging rhythms. That evening, behind the polished faces and the polite questions, something else took shape. Plans whispered in the dark, and the slow, certain turning toward a cellar no one outside the house had reason to know about. 2 weeks would give them time. Time to strengthen Catherine. Time to learn the house's secret passages. Time to prepare. Time, they both understood, was a kind of weapon. In the small hours, with the house asleep and the moon making a thin path across the drive, they began to move toward the place where the brethren kept their ledger, the place where names and dates could become accusation and perhaps retribution. They waited until the house had folded itself into evening and the world beyond the shutters had gone soft and slow. May 14th had come and gone. Silas left for Charleston in the morning, and by the slender mercy of his timetable, was not due back until the 17th. That gap was the geometry of their chance, the thin, lethal interval in which they could move without the master's footfall in the hall. They met after nightfall in Catherine's room, the dress she had worn to the dinner replaced by coarse, dark clothes and hair drawn back tight as a soldier's. She looked small in the doorway and vast in the center of the room, like someone who had borne storms and now learned to command them. The cellar entrance was hidden behind pantry paneling in the kitchen, a pressed board, a faint seam only visible to the one who had lived the rhythms of the house. The stairway sighed as they opened it, releasing a breath of old smoke and damp earth that smelled long of things swallowed and forgotten. Ezekiel carried a shuttered lantern, its light meager, a slot of gold in the black. They descended in a single file, the wood underfoot thin with age. After 20 steps, the world changed. Lower ceilings, packed earth underfoot, A room 30 feet square held together by thick beams that had borne the weight of 100 winters. At the center, what Catherine called the altar had become a blunt, terrible truth. Dark grooves in wood and a map of stains that answered no questions with comfort. Catherine moved like someone following a map stitched into memory. She pressed at a stone in the far wall, and it yielded with a click. A hidden chamber waited. Smaller, 10 feet square, the air colder and closer. On a stand in the center sat the ledger, massive, leather-bound, clasped with metal that had been polished by fingers that must have never thought to wash away their sin. The sight of it made Ezekiel's throat close. Shelves lined the walls, jars sealed with wax, cloth bundles, robes trimmed with crimson. Here was the private machinery of what those men called power. He opened the ledger with a reverence that was almost a sacrilege. Parchment spanned centuries, entries in a tidy, clinical hand that read like the notes of a surgeon who had long ago ceased to see his work as wrong. Names, dates, a ledger of rituals. Gatherings every 6 weeks. Sacrifices timed to planting and harvest. Notations about bodies that never left fields or swamps. The pages cataloged people, mostly those who had no voice in a court. Enslaved men and women, poor wanderers, the dispossessed. It also contained the brief cold lines that told Ezekiel what had been done to his family. A near-invisible jab of ink marked October 1838. Purchased family unit from Virginia, separated, dispatched to Alabama contact, payment received. 3 sterile lines for a life. They did not move quickly. They could not. Catherine copied names and dates into the papers she had brought. Coded pages that in their handwriting would look like nonsense to any cursory search. Ezekiel worked beside her, making tallies, mapping connections, time dilated. The work was ghastly and meticulous. Every entry they copied was a compass pointing toward the shape of a crime network hours past. Once, Catherine slid from the floor, hands pressed to her temples, and for a breath she tasted the shore of memory and retreated. But they pressed on. Patience had become their strategy. They had been below an hour when the sound reached them. The sound of light too bright for a single lantern, a hazard of presence on the other side of the hidden door. Ezekiel looked up, and the light carved Silas Rutled in the doorway, flanked by men who moved with the assurance of those who owned not only property, but also concealment behind them. Other figures filled the outer chamber like jury members who had come to render a verdict they had written in advance. Silas stepped into the inner room. As one steps into a confession that already went in his favor, he did not shout. He did not flinch. "I am impressed," he said softly, as if commenting on a piece of fine, ill-made furniture. "I did not think you would find the ledger." Catherine rose in a slow, terrible deliberation and stood between her father and Ezekiel. "You were supposed to be in Charleston," she said. "I went," Silas returned, "and I came back. I suspected something, so I returned early. I expected you to remember, child. I did not expect you to be so eager to play conspirator." There were 7 men occupying the outer chamber, and more threaded behind them. Men whose faces had been on invitations, whose names conferred ease. Judge Pelham, Reverend Crenshaw, merchants. They closed the doorway with a kind of ritual finality and led the pair upstairs to Silas's study. The door was locked from the outside. The room had one high transom too small to reach and no comfort but silence. Left together for a moment, Catherine folded like a coiled thing and then refocused. "Are you hurt?" she asked Ezekiel. "No," he said, "but we are in worse trouble than we thought." Silas did not wish to kill his daughter if he could help it. His voice betrayed that calculation. She was his blood. Even he counted blood in his ledger. He stood in front of the brethren and described the discovery with an economy that turned their anger into an opportunity. The assembly convened in the cellar again, this time with ceremony. Robes, candles, the altar draped in a heaviness that looked finally like something dead. Silas presented a proposition, as if offering payment on a bond. The man in his daughter's company had a grievance and a thirst for justice. Why not harness it? We have a crisis, Silas said, but also an opportunity to test our theory that our influence can bend even the will of those who would hate us. He turned to Ezekiel, making the whole circle a stage. We offer you membership of a kind, not equal, never equal, but associate status at our next gathering. You will prove yourself. In return, we will help you exact vengeance on the man in Alabama who took your family. Or refuse, and you die. The offer was obscene in its calculus and simple as sin. To live was to join hands with the men who had broken him. To refuse was to die in a chamber that had swallowed others. Catherine's response crystallized the ugliness of the proposal. She refused any simple abasement. "Kill me if you must," she said flatly, "but I will not be returned to the pillows and potions as a silenced thing." It did not take votes, only the merciless arithmetic of utility governed by cowardice and appetite both. They men proposed a bargain. Catherine would be sent north, given papers, a new name, a stipend, and exile. She would be removed from the scene. Legally alive, but effectively dead to the town. Ezekiel would be admitted, after a probationary period, into their circle as an associate, observed and bound by the same compacts that protected all who sat at their table. 3 weeks hence he would attend an initiation and be watched closely until then. Escape, treachery, or collusion with enemies would undo the bargain and end both their lives. Ezekiel had imagined 100 ways to ruin those men. He had not imagined this price. He watched his hands, felt the ledger's weight at his back, as if it were a still, heavy thing. Catherine looked at him with an expression that was not defeat, but a surgical clarity. "Trust me," her eyes seemed to say. She would go. She would not be gone. She left at dawn, escorted in silence. Ezekiel watched the carriage fold into the line of trees and disappear. It was a departure choreographed like a funeral. No goodbyes, only necessary orders. For the next 3 weeks, he lived under watch. 2 overseers hung to his shadow. He could go nowhere beyond the plantation bounds. He was given tasks that kept him visible but not useful. He was being tested, paraded to show that the brethren had not only power, but prudence, an ability to absorb a threat into the body politic and make it useful. Yet within that restraint lay the thing Ezekiel had wanted: access. He moved through the main house, took careful note of keys, routine, and the men who visited under the pretense of business. He learned which servants could be trusted, which overseers drank too much at dusk, which doors were bolted for habit, and which opened for sins. At night, alone in his cabin, he held the 3 names against his chest and promised them something he had no right to promise. Silas came to him on the night before the initiation. The man entered Ezekiel's room with a ledger of his own, the speech of a man who believed in the economy of threats and favors. He spoke of the brethren as if belonging were a service. Doors opened, enemies faltered, wealth found arms. He spoke of reform from inside, of how a voice at their table might improve the lot of the enslaved, a velvet poison laced with righteousness. And then, as if to display mercy, he offered the same cruel ultimatum in gentler tones. Do what we ask, however monstrous, and you and your daughter live refuse, and both are ashes." Ezekiel listened. He felt something cold and iron in his chest. The ledger's pages, the smell of tar and wax, the faces of his family crowded the dark. He understood, in the small of his body, how participation would mark him. Once he bled on their altar, he would be like them. Once he drank from their cup, the water would never be clean again. Yet the alternative was simpler: death and silence, a ledger with one fewer protest inscribed. He had thought to be monstrous only in purpose. Now he must consider being monstrous in method. He promised nothing aloud, but in his head he had a plan. A third option neither Silas nor the brethren could imagine. An act of violence of his own design, an instant that would tear their certainty and pull the shadows into daylight. When Silas left, Ezekiel sat with the paper that held his family's names and whispered, not to the men who had written the ledger, but to whatever ghosts kept memory, "Forgive me." He said to Sarah, to Benjamin, to Ruth, "Forgive me what I must become. I will not let this be for nothing." And so the night closed. The congregation of horrors arranged their rituals for the next midnight, believing themselves prepared to test their newest recruit. They expected the ritual to make Ezekiel complicit. They expected the ritual to bind him. They believed themselves in control, as all men who lean on cruelty always do, until the moment the ledger burned. The initiation began at midnight on June 3rd, a warm, windless night, the kind that pressed against the windows like a held breath. Ezekiel was led from his cabin by two robed brethren members, stripped to the waist, wrists bound behind him. They marched him toward the cellar entrance hidden behind the pantry wall. The house was quiet, but the air carried a tension so sharp it seemed to hum. Ezekiel stepped down the wooden stairs slowly, lantern light flickering against stone, the smell of earth thickening as the world narrowed around him. Below, the cellar had been transformed. Candles burned in every holder, bathing the chamber in an amber glow that stretched shadows like thin, reaching hands. The altar was draped in crimson cloth, its edges heavy and stained with so many years of use that no washing could ever erase the memory of what had been done there. 13 chairs formed a circle around the altar, 12 of them occupied by men robed in black and red. Silas stood at the head, hood lowered, the bare face of a man who believed everything in this room belonged to him. "Brothers of the harvest," Silas said, his voice filling the chamber with ritual weight. "Tonight, we welcome a man into our circle, a man shaped by loss, a man who has tasted suffering, a man who stands at the crossroads between obedience and destruction." Two brethren members stepped aside, revealing a figure bound and gagged on the altar. A young woman, an enslaved girl no older than 19, wrists lashed, eyes wide with terror. "This," Silas said, gesturing almost gently toward her, "is the test, the final measure of Ezekiel Cross's devotion. To join us, he must make the first cut, a symbolic gesture and a necessary one, a mark upon the flesh that binds him forever to our circle." The chanting began, low, rhythmic, syllables borrowed and corrupted from languages neither they nor the ones they stole from fully understood. Shadows jittered along the walls. The smell of sweat and candle smoke thickened. Silas extended a long, leather-handled knife toward Ezekiel. "Take it," he commanded. Ezekiel looked at the girl. Her breath came fast and shallow. Tears ran down her cheeks as she mouthed silent pleas behind the gag. Her eyes met his, dark, shining, desperate. In her face he saw the countless unnamed who had vanished into swamps, fields, and pits. He saw Sarah's soft singing voice in the evenings, Benjamin's bright mind, Ruth's small hands clutching wildflowers. He saw the ledger's cold, neat handwriting, reasons reduced to ink. He looked at Silas. The man waited, calm, expectant. Ezekiel reached out, took the knife, and for a moment the room seemed to exhale. The brethren leaned forward. The chanting deepened. Silas smiled. Ezekiel stepped toward the altar. The blade rose. Then he turned, quick as striking. The knife plunged into the throat of the nearest robed man, a wet sound, a gurgled cry. Blood arced across the altar as the man collapsed. Chaos detonated. Ezekiel ripped the collapsing man's robe off him in a single motion and flung it over a cluster of candles. Sudden darkness swallowed half the room as flames choked beneath fabric. Men shouted, stumbling, reaching for their own weapons too slowly. Ezekiel moved with the clarity of someone who had lived in a cage long enough to know exactly where the bars were weakest. He lunged toward another man, using the body of the first as a shield. A knife meant for Ezekiel embedded itself in the dead man's back. Ezekiel shoved, hurling the corpse at two brethren members and sending them crashing to the ground. He pivoted, kicked hard against a knee joint. Bone cracked sharply. A lantern hit the floor. Hot oil spread. Flames leapt. He grabbed a metal candle holder, swung it into a man's face. Bone shattered with a sickening snap when the young woman on the altar thrashed and tried to pull free. Ezekiel climbed onto the table, cutting her bonds in a swift, efficient motion. "Run," he rasped. "Run! Up the stairs! Go!" She bolted, stumbling as she fled, nearly falling in the smoke-thick air before disappearing through the cellar door. By now, only 7 brethren remained upright, Silas among them. Ezekiel turned, breathing hard, knife still in hand, robe half covered in blood. His sweat gleamed in the candlelight. He looked like something carved from fury. Silas stared at him with disbelief and a strange, grudging awe. "You have sealed your fate," Silas said quietly. "And hers." "Maybe," Ezekiel answered. "But I will not die alone." He braced himself for the next onslaught, but he didn't know Catherine had returned. She had not gone north. She had not taken the carriage meant to remove her. She had slipped into the slave quarters the night of her supposed departure, hiding among people who had known her since she was a child. People who had watched her suffer under Silas's cruelty and understood the quiet, dangerous glint in her eyes. Over 3 weeks, she moved through the quarters and fields, under moonlight, whispering truths into ears that had been waiting decades for a call to action. She told them about the cellar, about the ledger, about the brethren. She told them the night justice could be taken back was coming. And when they listened, men and women who had buried children, who had mourned vanished spouses, who had spent lifetimes bending beneath overseers, they found within themselves a fury that could no longer be bounded. 23 came, armed with axes, sickles, hammers, and the unbroken will that comes to those with nothing left to fear. When the young woman Ezekiel freed burst from the cellar screaming, Catherine did not hesitate. "Now," she whispered. They surged forward. The cellar door flew open as the enslaved people of Cypress Grove flooded down the stairs like a tide of vengeance. The brethren turned, startled, disoriented. Silas's confidence fractured. Panic split the chamber like a lightning crack. What followed was not a battle. It was an eruption. Judge Palem managed to draw a pistol before a hammer crushed his skull. Reverend Crenshaw dropped to his knees, begging. But mercy had no place in the room where he had long practiced none. Marcus Fanning tried to escape up the stairs. 6 hands pulled him back into the darkness he had helped create. The brethren fought. But their strength had never been in their hands. It had lived in secrecy, in fear, in laws written by men like themselves against a people who had carried torment in their bodies for lifetimes, who had endured and endured and endured. Against them, the brethren were nothing but soft and mortal. Silas saw the slaughter closing around him and seized Catherine, dragging her back against him with a knife pressed to her throat. "Stop!" he shouted. "Stop, or I kill her!" The room froze. Fire crackled somewhere behind them. Smoke crawled along the low ceiling. Catherine did not tremble. She looked into her father's eyes, eyes that had watched her break, watched her convulse on poisoned medicine, watched her sanity rot, watched her fear, watched her scream, and she felt nothing. "Do it," she said. "Kill me. It will not save you. Nothing will." Silas's grip wavered. Catherine struck. An elbow driven into his ribs with bone-deep fury, he gasped, loosened. She twisted free, stepping aside just enough. Ezekiel was already moving. He faced Silas Rutled fully now, the man who smiled while tearing his family apart, the man who had ordered him into Catherine's room to begin this entire unraveled fate, the man who believed himself untouchable. "You took everything from me," Ezekiel said softly, as though delivering a eulogy. "My wife, my children, their futures, and you did it only because you could." Silas dropped the knife. His lips trembled. "Please," he whispered. Ezekiel's eyes were cold. "Did Sarah say please? Did Benjamin? Did Ruth?" Silas opened his mouth, but Ezekiel stepped forward. "No mercy. Not for you." What happened then was quick, decisive, and final, and the last breath of Silas Rutled left him on the cellar floor, surrounded by the men he had once called brothers. The reckoning was complete when it ended. The cellar was littered with bodies. The rituals that had taken so many lives had taken their last. Catherine stood in the center, trembling not from fear, but from release, her chest rising and falling in slow, stunned relief. Smoke wreathed her hair like a crown. Ezekiel stepped to her side. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she answered. "Are you?" "A few cuts," he murmured. "Nothing that matters." She looked around. The altar, the robes, the symbols carved into stone. "Now we burn it," she said. "Everything." They moved with grim purpose. The enslaved people who had fought with them slipped away into the night before dawn, disappearing back to their plantations, carrying the truth folded inside them like a deadly secret. They would say nothing. They owed the world nothing. They owed themselves survival. Ezekiel and Catherine poured oil through the chamber, set bodies in positions that would mimic collapse rather than battle. They dragged crates and wood, stacked tinder. They piled the ledger and journals on the altar. Ezekiel hesitated. He opened the ledger one last time and tore out the pages documenting his family's fate, folded them, pressed them to his chest. "For them," he whispered. "For memory." Then Catherine lit the match. Flames bloomed instantly, hungry and eager, devouring robes, books, secrets. Smoke rose thick and black, crawling up stairways, filling hallways. They fled the house as fire claimed it. Outside, beneath the paling sky of dawn, they stood together watching Cypress Grove collapse into its own ashes. The fire roared, a judgment long overdue, a cleansing that erased but also revealed. "What will you do now?" Catherine asked quietly. "Go north," Ezekiel said. "Disappear. Help others escape. Build something that hurts the men who built this." She nodded slowly. "I'll go north too. I have money, hidden from him for years, enough to start again." "And your testimony?" Ezekiel asked. She looked at the burning house. "I'll write it," she whispered. "Code it. Hide it someday. Someone will find it. Not now." not when it could kill us. But one day, they stayed until the fire died, until nothing but ash and twisted timbers remained. When the sun finally crested the trees, they parted, two figures walking into opposite directions of the same haunted world. The story that followed was the one they wrote for the world. An accident, a candle, a tragic fire. The 13 most respected men in the county lost in a moment. Catherine Rutled, poor, fragile Catherine, dead in her room. The enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross, sold to Alabama Cypress Grove, liquidated. The truth buried under ash, silence, and fear. But stories take on lives of their own. Whispers seeped into fields, traveled down rivers among enslaved people. Tales spread about a plantation that burned because its masters angered the wrong spirits. A woman who remembered too much. A man who carried fire in his bones. A ledger no one could find. A journal that surfaced decades later, coded, indecipherable, and then vanished again. And rumors of a man in the north who helped others slip free, who moved through shadows like someone who had once fought monsters and lived history, forgot what the fire tried to erase. But memory clings like smoke to timber. Cypress Grove fell, but its story endured.